we'll go ahead and just have prayer and launch in. So let's bow our heads for prayer. Heavenly Father, as we are exiting sacred time, that time carved out of each week to spend especially with you, we're grateful that our lives are not wrapped around one day with you and 6 by ourselves. So we're not entering a week without your presence. And tonight we're wanting to talk about your desire to be present in every day and aspect of our lives. And so I just pray that you would be with us, guide us as we spend these moments together, and may we each walk away with something that can be helpful in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. I want you to take a moment and think back and maybe visit with the person beside you. We'll take about 2, maybe 3 minutes, and then I'd be interested if we had 2 or 3, maybe 4 at the most, people who would give the briefest of answer to this question. Who's had the greatest impact on your financial perceptions in life? As you think back, and you think back to different individuals that have been influential, whether growing up or later in life. So think about that for a moment, and in about 60, 90 seconds, I look for a couple people who'd be willing to share, just briefly, here's who impacted me. So feel free to discuss that with the person beside you, share it maybe, and then we'll look for some sharing. See you. All right, anybody willing to share, as you think back, who's had an impact in your financial perceptions, how you approach life, how you approach finances in particular? Somebody want to share briefly who it was, and maybe just a tiny window on what it was that they left the impression. Yes? Okay, so a Bible class where you had to get together and actually plan financially for a year as if you were a couple. So that experience where you were forced to confront it before you confronted it. Good. Okay. So an allowance that you got to play on a small scale, which prepared you as you grew up to work with more money. Yes?
Well, obviously my parents.
Yes?
But before my husband and I got married, Edward Reed has an excellent book on accounting for your finances. He also has a great 10-part series on audiobooks.
Uh-huh. Okay, so for you, the Ed Reed series especially was very helpful in connecting finances and biblical picture. Excellent. One more.
Parents taught me how to give. Dave Ramsey taught me how to have enough to give.
Okay, so growing up with parents. Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you. So why should I even care about finances? Too often, we see the stress that comes when you're just trying to get 1 month to the next. You know people for whom each month is a challenge. Money Magazine had this to say a couple years ago: the top 3 worries when surveying people: having enough for retirement, so long-term worry, how would I manage if an emergency hit? And by the way, about 60% of Americans would have difficulty putting their hands on $400 outside of a credit card if an emergency hit. So most Americans, the majority, would have difficulty putting their hands on that kind of money if they didn't use a credit card. And then the third worry was, I'm living paycheck to paycheck. Of course, maybe the biggest worry now, I just saw a headline that they're calling this the FOMO, F-O-M-O market, fear of missing out. So here, as the market's going great, everybody's piling in at the last moment. They're afraid of missing out on the big gains. Maybe that's people's biggest worry now. But 3 years ago, that's where it was. And money's still the number one source of marital arguments, and 41% of couples surveyed said that arguments occur at least once per month. Serious arguments, not just a discussion on, well, maybe we shouldn't have done that, but serious arguments. So, number one, it can be a big stressor at an individual level or a couple level. And yet you contrast that with what Jesus had to say. You know, he said, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have what? Life, and have it to the full or abundantly, depending on what translation you grew up with. He said, I want you to have the richest life possible. That's my goal for you, is to live richly. And this promise, probably something we ought to paste on most of our mirrors. So when we get up in the morning, we just remember this wonderful promise. God says, look, you put my kingdom first, and I'll take care of the rest. That will be my responsibility. You don't have to spend your life worrying about everything else. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. For others, it's just, what's the minimum payment? Whether it's a car or an audio system or whatever it is. The only question is what's the minimum payment? Can I make the minimum payment? And I'll go for it. Our goal really, though, is to hit a target. And that's most of what I want to talk about tonight, is making sure that rather than finances being the tail that wags the dog, that we know where we're headed, that we have a direction, and that we aren't just going wherever money leads us. For many people, they're doing okay financially, but they aren't headed in a direction. They're kind of directionless. I like this passage from 1 Timothy 6 that reminds us what true success is. It's not a certain number that I reach in my account. I've been a success when I have a net worth of this much or this much saved for retirement, even though those things are very important. This passage by Paul says there is what? Great gain in godliness with contentment, for we brought nothing into the world and we cannot take anything out of it. So if we were to put that into a math formula, basically says godliness, a relationship with God, plus contentment equals what? Great gain. If you and I have that, we have a relationship with God, and we have contentment wherever that is in life, we have great gain. I'm just going to run briefly through these texts. We did them this morning. Maybe it's your chance to check and see what you caught from this morning, the 3 major texts. They're on your handout now. If you have a pen to start following along, we won't go deep into the texts, but Psalm 50 reminds us that God owns everything, right? It's all God's anyway. It's easy to talk about mine and my and ours, but ultimately, it's God's, every bit of it. So number one, it's all God's anyway. And Deuteronomy reminded us it all came from God. So it's all God's. Anything that I have, you remember that was the text that Moses said, if you're tempted to think that you did it, remember it's God that has given you everything you have. He's the one that gives you the strength. He's the one that gives you the mental capacity, etc. So it all came from God. And then there was the partnership offer from Malachi. So that third one, God's partnership offer. And you remember that's where he says, look, let's be partners and we'll begin a journey such that you'll never want to do business any other way than in partnership with me. So those are kind of the foundational texts that I think put all of finances into perspective. Let's take a couple minutes and discuss. You just turn to somebody next to you. What practical difference would it make in the lives of those around you, people you know at work, in your extended family, etc., if they lived with the conviction that everything they possessed came from God and He wanted to partner with them in every area of their lives, including the financial? Can you think of any examples what that might look like? So if you just take a bit and discuss the question, what practical difference would it make in the lives of those around you if we felt that everything we have is God's, came from God, and we're managing it for Him? What practical difference would that make? Go ahead and let's take a couple minutes, turn to somebody and discuss that. And then I'd be looking for a couple people who might be willing to share, 2-3 sentences on what difference they think that would make in the lives of those around them. All right, another 30 seconds, and then if we had a couple volunteers who would share 1 or 2 sentences in what that might look like in those around you. Okay, anybody want to share? What practical difference would it make in the lives of those around you if they lived with the conviction that everything they possessed came from God and He wanted to partner with them? What might be some practical benefits that you would see in the lives of those around you? Okay, it would change attitudes, wouldn't it? Suddenly, that selfishness that says, I'm the center, it would be transformed. Excellent. If I'm partnering with God, It's no longer about me. Good. Somebody else. What difference, doctor?
Worry would probably be much less of a concern. If you really thought that God was with you in every aspect of your life, you were committing your life entirely to Him, then why would you worry? You know, He's got you in the palm of His hand, and He'll take care of you wherever, and be with you in that circumstance.
That's huge, isn't it? I mean, truly, if it's it's his problem as well. If I'm wrestling with something, if I'm following his leadership, it's his problem. He said, "You worry about the kingdom, I'll take care of the rest." So yeah, it would be a major reduction in my personal worry if I would live that. Anybody else? Okay, so a journey, a learning journey, and a mentoring journey where you're passing that on to others. Excellent. Anybody else? Mace.
I think if we really believed that God was a partnership, that we would be more careful about what we spend our money on. You know, I can review over my life, and I wonder how I could be so stupid. But, you know, it's, because we do so many things that don't do us any good. And we think we're going ahead, but actually we're going backwards. If we took God into consideration, a lot of these things we wouldn't do. And we would be, financially, we would be a long ways ahead.
Okay, so if we thought, if we truly kept partnership in mind, it would make a difference in the decisions we make, and we might look back with fewer regrets on some of the things we've done. Excellent. A couple other benefits that I think of. You already mentioned the lack of worry, or there's a peace. I mean, God talks about a peace that passes understanding, does not make sense. It's that level of peace. And obviously, if I'm connecting with God, I think there'd be a peace that would come, certainly less stress. I heard somebody say less stress. And I think there'd be within families, and we want to talk a bit more about that, but there'd be a sense of unity, that we're together, not only we're working with God, but we're working with each other. And maybe that's why Jesus had so much to say about money. He actually said more about money than he did about prayer or heaven, because money really reflects life, doesn't it? I mean, if you open my checkbook, well, not so much anymore, I don't use much of a checkbook. If you looked at my credit card statement, you should be able to tell my values, right? I mean, because where my money is going to reflect what's important to me. And maybe that's why Jesus talks so much about money, because it's such a reflection of who I am and what my values are. And then I think especially as couples, it can be helpful. And by the way, it seems like usually we talk about opposites attracting. Usually one in a couple is more interested in finances, more adept at finances than the other. And I firmly believe still that finances should be, if you are married, should be something that you do together. And when I say that, it doesn't mean that everything you do together, you're not doing every aspect of it, you all pay the bills together. No, what I'm saying is I think both ought to be involved in the finances. Now, it may not be that, the one just could care less about the details. But I do believe it should be something that couples at least connect on. And it can make a huge difference. Occasionally, finances, what if neither in a couple is adept at finances? You ever known somebody where neither one of them had an aptitude for finances? What do you do then? Okay, I think, getting mentoring, find somebody that you look up to that has some financial ability and say, hey, could you help us? Get professional help. Get somebody who comes alongside you and says, hey, we'll guide you. There's nothing wrong with saying, maybe you didn't grow up with parents who modeled anything that you want to repeat. That's not uncommon. I have known many professionals, very successful, who would say, I didn't get anything from my parents. And there's nothing wrong with saying, I could use some help in this area just like any other area of life. What are some of the pitfalls of doing finances separately as a couple, having completely separate finances, his and hers? What does that do? Pardon me? Okay, makes you selfish. It doesn't take too long and you can start looking at who's doing how much, etc. Rarely do people earn the same, etc. And it doesn't take long, and you really focus on yourself. Certainly my wife and I have not earned the same. She's volunteered most of her life. And yet she's the one that keeps much of our family going. So you could never evaluate value based on who's bringing home what money. So I really think finances should be done together. Let's jump into your handout there. I want to look at a number of steps, simple steps that I think are so crucial to living a financially fulfilling life, singly or as a couple. So number one is to prayerfully turn finances over to God. If you're married, doing that together. I don't find that this is something that people have ever thought of, many people have ever thought of. I mean, we say we participate in tithes or offerings, but to actually say, God, I want to partner with you, and if you're married, as a couple, kneeling down, having prayer, and committing your finances to God. Does some amazing things. Proverbs 16:1 says, we can make our own plans, but the Lord gives the right answer. Do you believe that? If he's willing to be our partner, are our plans going to be a whole lot better? No question. Commit your actions to the Lord, Proverbs says, just a couple verses later, and your plans will succeed. I would like to know that my plans are going to succeed. And God's promise is that if you and I commit our plans to him, which is not just saying, God, here's my plans, would you bless them? It's saying, God, what are your plans involved in my life? He said, we'll make a success of where you are in life. Doesn't mean that we instantly get rich or any of that, but there'll be that peace, that stress-free life that happens as we partner with him. Step number 2 is to determine where you are financially. How do you do this? How do you determine where you are financially? What's the basic step? And this is a very basic step. What do you do? Some of you do this on a regular basis. Some have never done it.
Factor in your expenses, whatever fixed costs or things that you can't change.
Okay, so you're going to look at what's flowing in, what's flowing out. You're going to do a budget. Even before that, many people have never added up assets and liabilities, a basic balance sheet. Not hard. I mean, it sounds pretty intense, but no, you're just saying, what do I own and what do I owe? I would actually recommend that you do that at least once a year. At the end of the year, sit down and at least rough out a balance sheet. It lets you know, am I going forwards or backwards? And then the way to shape that is to figure out, after you figured out what do I own and what do I owe, what's coming in and what's going out, and how does that make a difference? Number 3, and this is where I want to spend a little time. And by the way, if you have any desire for things that might help you as far as paperwork, I brought paperwork that every once in a while somebody says, well, do you have something that would give me an idea of a balance sheet? Well, I've got a simple balance sheet. They're not hard. I mean, you can do them on the back of a piece of paper, napkin, whatever. I've also got some paper that might be of help to you. So number 3 is to determine where you want to go, and that's dealing with goals and values. So values tend to be general and will rarely change. So this is your own personal values. This is family values. Goals tend to be specific, will be short, medium, or long-term, and once met, they may be finished. You may be done with that goal and it never comes back. Do you see the difference? So values, what would be some examples of values? They tend to be general and will rarely change. What would be some examples? Let's do a little brainstorming. You can just call it out. I'll give a simple one that's obvious. It kind of takes away your chance for a simple, obvious one, but it might get you started. You may say, I have a goal in 5 years of being debt-free, or at least having paid off everything but my house, or something like that. So the value would be being debt-free. We choose to live our lives debt-free. Now, the goal might be, I want to be debt-free in 3 or 5 or 10 years or whatever. But the value would be, we value being debt-free. Okay, what would be some other values? Not goals, but values. When you think of your family, okay, you might say, we value Christian education. That's a family value. Now, obviously, some goals might grow out of that, but you might say, that's a value in our family. We value Christian education in its various forms. Okay, what would be some other values? Okay, honesty and integrity. We are going to operate everything we do based on honesty and integrity. That's going to mark every bit of what we do. Okay, what else? What are some other values? Okay, you might say, I have this value of living a generous life. Good. What else? What would be some values? Any others? Okay, you say, I want to support God's work. I want to make a difference in some specific causes that God has put on my heart. And that's a value. I'm going to live my life shaped around being able to do that. Here's some other values that people might have. And our values will be as unique as the different families represented here. It could be people would have a value of maximizing yearly vacations to build memories while children are young. I mean, that could be a value. So I want some memories. Could be you say, I want a parent to stay home with the children, or as you mentioned, generous support of a cause. I want to be generously supporting something, or live debt-free. Those are values. Any others that pop to mind? Support Christian education, either for your own family or if you're in a position to do it for other families. Those would be values. Okay, goals tend to be specific. Will be short, medium, or long-term, and once met, may be finished. So here's a couple examples. If one of your values is regular vacations that will build memories, a goal might be, I want to save $2,400 annually for a vacation. You know, early in life, you're saying, we want to do something every year with the kids, or invest for children's education, etc. So what would be some other goals? So these are not values, these are now goals, and goals are almost easier. What would be some goals that you can think of? Popping up a couple others up here. Paying off consumer debt, which would be credit cards, etc. That would be a goal. Save for a mission trip. Begin investing regularly. So again, values tend to be general and will rarely change. Goals tend to be specific, will be short, medium, or long term. And when we talk about short, medium, or long term, what kind of time frames are we looking at typically when we talk about short, medium, and long term? What would be a long-term goal? What's the time frame for a long-term goal? Okay, 10 plus. Many people would say that's kind of, there's no hard and fast rule, but 10 plus. So a goal that it's something I'm going to end up meeting 10 years, 20, 30 years. That's a long-term goal. So medium length or intermediate term goal would be what? Okay, 5 to 10 might even come down to 2 to 10. And short term would be, what am I doing this year and next year? So now let's go ahead and work together as a, you can do it yourself, you can do it with your spouse. If you've got a spouse here, family members, put down 3 to 5 family values on paper. So these would be values that you would say, these are financial values that mark our family. Okay, so go ahead and jot those down. You've got some space there. Okay, about another minute, just brainstorming some values that you would say, these are values that do or that we want to mark our financial life. Anybody want to share? Just a one-liner that you've jotted down, something that you would say, this is a value that we want to mark our family.
I think we've agreed on the level of risk we are comfortable with,
Okay,
to where we don't feel regretful that we didn't, cash in on the stock market. We've kind of chosen to invest in real estate in these places.
okay, so you've got a value that says we want to be able to sleep at night and yet feel like we can make our money work for us.
We are not worried unduly about what we could have done or worried about how we're going to lose it.
Okay, so one of your values would be to operate in a way that you live without worry or regrets. Okay, good. Somebody else. Okay, so just to say, I like having a margin, a backup, and I want to make that a value, not just when I see something coming up, but I just want to live in a way that I couldn't be pushed up against the wall by every little thing that happens. I want to live a life, okay, good. Anybody else? Value that you'd want to put down that you'd say, this marks our family. Okay? And that has implications, doesn't it? I mean, these values have implications with how I live my life. Every value, if it's implemented, has financial repercussions. There's things I do or can't do because of my values if I'm truly implementing them. Pardon me? Yes, biblical.
Remembering that when you're asking your brother or your sister to do your chores for you, has an impact on how the rest of the week might go.
Yes. It's a nice early lesson that can pay dividends down the road. Okay?
Weigh our present needs and wants based on what our future needs may be.
Okay.
Because we tend to live for today, and next thing we know it's tomorrow, right?
Okay, so keeping a future orientation, not just living for today, but a value that says, I want to keep my eye on the future. I want to know where I want to be at that point. Good. Okay. What would be some ideas on how you can keep your values front and center? It's one thing to say, here's some of my values. What are some ways, because at least I find that it's easy to slip away from them. How can you remind yourselves of the values that are important to your family? Okay, so making sure that there's something you do up front and not, okay. And I think that type of attitude is critical when we look at values and goals. Because if you say, here's what we want to do, and you make sure you do it first, how likely is it to happen? What if I say, well, if things are left over, here's what I'd like to do? It's not going to happen, is it? No. So we can say, I have a value that I want one parent to stay home with children. But if you keep waiting for when that just happens, will it ever happen? It won't. And I think this is one of the benefits of knowing your family's values is it allows you to make choices and decisions based on what's most important to you. And when you look at something, whether it's a current want or whatever, you can compare that to your values and say, okay, this is going to cost us significantly. How does that compare to the value we've said of having somebody stay at home? I visit with families who might say, one of our goals is we want mom to stay home. And I grew up with a mom that was home. That was a rich blessing. I have a family that says, we want mom to stay home. And yet they say we can't. It's so frustrating. And yet they've made other choices that have kept them from reaching that goal. They'd say that, that's our number one goal, number one value. And yet when it comes down to it, the house and the new car, etc., has trumped that goal. Now, if your goal is to always have the newest car and be in a new house, then you've arrived. But if your goal, your value, is to have a parent stay home with your children, it helps you weigh what's really important to us. What would happen if once a year you took a weekend? If it was as a couple or a family, you set the weekend aside to go over your values, not just financial, but spiritual, etc., and just said, how are we doing? And you actually, over that weekend, prayerfully went over, here's our values, here's our goals. How are we doing as a way of keeping them front and center? Let's go on to goals. So short-term financial goals, I put here less than 18 months. It could be, it's 18, a year and a half, 2 years. Medium-term financial goals, somewhere in there to 10 years, and then long-term goals, 10 plus. Other places you may see 7 or 8 plus, but 10 years is a nice, easy amount there. So what would be some examples of some short-term financial goals? Give me some examples on something that could be completed potentially in 18 to 24 months. What would be an example of some short-term goals? Okay, you know that you've got an appliance that's dying or a car that has a transmission that's going out, and you could look ahead and say, it's not a long-term goal. It doesn't take me 10 years to do that, but I've got something significant that's going to need replacing. So, okay, what else? Be some short-term goals. Pardon me? Vacation. Okay, vacation. Say, hey, next year we want to do something big, and it's going to cost more than usual. So we're going to work on that. What else? Okay, mission trip. Yeah, something I may not have on hand, but I say, I want to go on a mission trip in a year from now, so we're just going to systematically put something aside. How about a medium-term financial goal? What would be something that I would look at to try to do in 1.5 to 2, clear out to 10 years? What would be some intermediate-term goals? Okay, save money for the next car. This it's not on its last legs, but it's not going to last for 15 or 20 years either. So you'd like to be ready for that. Good. Okay. Pardon me? Okay, education. You say, hey, we want to be ready. There's going to be some big expenses coming up in the next 4 years, 6 years. Okay, what else? Okay, so maybe in that time frame, you could say, I want to clear off everything, all my consumer debt. Yeah, short term, you might knock off 2 or 3 credit cards. Intermediate term, you might eliminate everything but your house. Or if you're close, the house might even fall in there. So what would be some long-term goals? Okay. Okay. So that might, to begin doing that might be a short-term goal, although you might do it for an extended period of time. So if it's a long-term goal might be paying off your house early, but getting started on that might be 2 or 3 months from now. Let's make adjustments so that we can start putting extra on our house. Now, which of these tends to be the most difficult to implement? Short-term, medium-term, or long-term goals? Okay, a lot of you are saying long-term. Why? Okay, one, you said the Lord's coming. Don't have to plan that far ahead because we know he's coming sooner than, we don't have to worry. Our kids will never get to the age of college. Won't have to be prepared to pay for a wedding. There's no way he can put off his coming that I would need to prepare for retirement. Right? I mean, that's, okay, so that's one reason. I think what were you saying over here? There's not the sense of urgency. Is that true? Do you find that? It's delayed gratification. If you know you've got a car that the transmission's going out, there is some urgency, at least for many people. Not all people. I know some for whom that doesn't bother them till it leaves them stranded. But for most people, there's a sense of urgency. Funding the retirement may not have that sense of urgency, right? I mean, if it's a long ways away. So if you're working on goals, I really would recommend that you put the greatest emphasis on the longest term ones, because the others are so easy to put off those long-term ones and pick up especially the short term, maybe the intermediate term. So let's take a bit and brainstorm on some goals. So we did values. Values were things that will likely be lifelong or near lifelong. I mean, we talked about mom staying home with the kids. Obviously, you're hoping the kids don't stay home with mom for the rest of their lives. So that may not be a forever value, but it's close. It's something that is part of your life. Goals are something that are going to be specific, that you reach an end to. You meet it. So go ahead and jot down some short, medium, and long-term goals. And on the next page, you've got some places for those. So jot down some ideas on what some short-term goals. Could be things that you're already working on. Could be some things you'd like to work on. All right, anybody willing to share a one-liner of a goal? We can't get deep into it, but just something that you'd say either I'd like to have this as a goal or this is a goal we're working on, and then we'll go ahead and we'll head downstairs. But let's toss out a couple goals and do that before we break. What would you put down as some goals, short-term, medium-term, or long-term? Okay, so have an emergency fund so you are not one of those, the broad point of Americans that can't put their hands on some money as needed. A great goal. Okay. Okay, so being ready for the college hit. Yes, good. Somebody else. Okay, paint the house. Boy, for me, that's even worse than the money is just the thinking about that. I hate painting. Okay, so work with the kids on memorizing some scripture. So that'd be a goal even outside the financial arena that's part of your values of raising kids that love and honor God. Excellent. Any others? Short, medium, or long-term goal? Okay. Especially to be able to do that without just loading it up on debt and then paying for it after the fact. So preparing to say we'll have it largely, partially paid for. Great type of goal. Okay, so a goal would be, I want to do something, a rental property that could bring in some investment down the road. Good. All right. When we come back, we'll jump into the nitty-gritty of, okay, how do we take these and implement them, and how do they help us as options come up for other goals? What do we do if we can't agree as a couple, etc.? So what happens when I have a goal and my wife has another and they don't agree? Things like that. So let's head downstairs. I think there's some light food prepared there. We'll go ahead and eat a little bit and then head back up here to wrap it up.